The sky above the prairie was ablaze with the last rays of the setting sun, coloring the horizon a fiery scarlet and golden pink. A thin breeze lifted dry dust from the parched earth, creating a light mist like a ghostly cover over the desert plain. The silence of the prairie was almost sacred, with only the rustle of grass, the quiet roar of cows in the distance, and the occasional cry of a lone bird flying off into the night. In the distance, on the horizon, the figure of a woman slowly loomed up. She was walking along the thin path that cut through the steppe, lonely and tired, like a spirit lost between worlds. Her clothes were wrinkled and dusty, her hair tangled by the wind, and her eyes, staring ahead, held a world of unspoken pain and loneliness. Each step seemed heavy, but there was a hidden determination in her gait, as if somewhere ahead, beyond the boundless steppe, hid hope. The path she was walking was long and grueling. Years of nameless days spent in shelters and strangers' homes, years of fear and loneliness. But ahead was an emptiness that seemed both terrifying and tantalizing. No home, no family, no past to give support. Just a deserted road and a cold wind that whispered forgotten names. She approached slowly, as if the world held its breath, watching her from behind the bushes, through the thickets, from a distance. Her figure rose out of the twilight, a shadow against the purple sky. Her face was hidden beneath the brim of her hat, but the last rays of sunlight brought out the delicate features, lips pressed tight with fatigue and eyes that held an unbearable longing laced with hidden strength. She was silent, just walking, as if she herself had become part of the landscape, a ghost that had forgotten its name and past, but had no power to go forward. Behind the woman's back remained the sunset, slowly fading light, and ahead, the dark outlines of the hills, hiding something new, uncharted and scary. Her journey was just beginning. Dust, like an eternal companion, was embedded in every fold of Maria's clothing, covering her weary body with a dull grey coating. The fabric of her dress, once white or light, now lost its freshness and smoothness. Frayed and worn, it hung over her skinny shoulders, barely covering her tired skin. The wind dragged the hem, revealing withered ankles that seemed too thin to hold the weight of her life. Her hands, calloused and covered in a layer of dust, were scratched, with tiny wounds that testified to a difficult journey of hardship and loneliness. Her face, shadowed by a shabby hat, bore the mark of days gone by. The deep shadows under her eyes, the parched lips, and the sparse hair poking out from beneath a hastily braided shawl. Every breath seemed like an effort, as if life itself were supported on a thin thread that could break at any moment. But even in this fatigue, in this brokenness, there was a quiet, stubborn determination. She would not allow herself to break. Maria carried a small knot tied tightly with a rope made of old cloth. In that knot was her whole world, her whole story, everything she had left behind after fleeing, a few changes of clothes, a few things she couldn't part with. Hidden in it were traces of the past that she wanted to forget, but she couldn't throw away. The knot was heavy, but she held it tightly, as if it were an anchor holding her to this vast world of unknowns. Her gaze, looking forward, was both anxious and hopeful. It read memories, dark and gloomy, hidden from the eyes of others, but also a promise not to give up. It was the story of a survivor, a woman who had lost her name and her past, but had not lost herself. She walked not just on the ground, she walked through her own fears, through the pain and fears that clutched her heart like iron pincers. In the distance, the sunset was blazing behind her, its fiery reflections touching only the edge of her silhouette. The wind playfully kicked up dust, and she seemed part of the void, part of a space where no one was waiting for her. But with each step she was getting closer to something new, a place where she could start over, with no past and no promises, only the dream of freedom. This was a story not only of escape, but of strength, the strength to keep going no matter what. Mary, a woman with no name, no home, no protection, walked forward, leaving shadows behind to find her way among the wild, harsh West. The wind whispered around her, taking with it the last remnants of the past, but inside Maria a silence raged, full of words she could not speak aloud. Scraps of her childhood surfaced in her mind, the grey walls of the orphanage, where the children's faces were as lost as her own, where any hope had faded under harsh discipline and indifference, and every word had sounded like a sentence, where the hands that were supposed to protect had turned to cruelty and pain, leaving permanent scars on body and soul. She remembered the cold nights when the sounds of crying mingled with the wind outside the window, and no one came to take away the fear. She remembered the fear that settled in her firmly and forever, the fear of being forgotten, of being nothing. Fleeing had become her only impulse to freedom, fleeing not only from places and faces, but from herself, from a name that no longer sounded, from a family she had lost in the fog of forgetting. A lost name is more than just a word. It's a part of the soul, a piece of the past that can't be brought back once it's gone forever. She couldn't remember who she used to be, couldn't find herself in the mirror of the past. Only this road ahead, covered in dust and anxiety, was her present. But amidst this pain and emptiness, like a smouldering fire in the depths of her soul, something new was brewing, a desire to start over. Not just to forget, but to create herself on her own terms, to find a place where you could not be afraid to be yourself, where you could breathe freely and not look back. It was not just a dream, but a necessity, a challenge to the universe, an answer to its torment. In that inner voice, there was not only pain, but strength, the strength to be alive, to go on despite everything, the strength to stop being a victim and become the mistress of her own destiny. She understood that the path would be difficult, but it was hers, and only she could decide who she would become and what her name would be. The wind continued to carry dust, mixing it with the memories, but Mary walked on, forward, toward a new beginning. Hope blossomed in her heart, fragile but strong, like a young escape in the cruel world of the Wild West. The path Mary followed led to a tiny settlement hidden among the hills and scattered pines. A few broken houses with rickety roofs, an old saloon with cracked windows, and a sign that the wind had long ago nearly obliterated. This place seemed like a forgotten time, where each day stretched on slowly, like thick smoke from a campfire. When Maria stepped onto the dusty street, the stares of passers-by instantly fell upon her, suspicious, cold, as if they sensed a stranger brought by the wind from afar. Adults and children, men with tired faces, and women with wary eyes, whispered among themselves, not hiding their curiosity and distrust. She could feel it on her, like an invisible wall erected by silent misunderstanding. In the saloon, the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses was interrupted when the door closed behind Maria with a low rumble. She noticed how the voices slowly died down, how people hid their faces behind their mugs and the smoke of their pipes. No one approached, no one invited her in. Here she was a stranger. No name, no past, no right to be here. Her clothes, shabby, dusty, with faded stains, stood out among the locals in their simplicity and wear and tear. Her hands, tired and splintery, clutched a small knot as if it were the only thing she had left to live on. She did not make eye contact with those who followed her, nor did she look for recognition or pity. The whispers intensified, but she didn't turn around. Her footsteps sounded quieter on the wooden planks in front of the saloon, where men leaned against the bar and cast leering glances. She knew that any words were only an attempt to understand someone else's unwillingness to accept. Her silence was stronger than steel, her gaze colder than the fall wind. She didn't answer questions, didn't explain, didn't try to fit into this world where every story was time-tested and cruel, where an outsider was expected with suspicion and even hostility. Her road lay ahead, and she wasn't going to stop for other people's opinions or unsolicited advice. In this quiet, almost empty backwater, she remained a shadow, something shaky, elusive, unrecognized, and in that, perhaps, was her first real defense: invisibility, loneliness, and fear that no one could disturb. She walked on, toward the horizon, where the eternal sunset promised a new day at least for herself. On the outskirts of the settlement stood an ancient tree, a branching oak whose roots were firmly embedded in the ground, as if clinging to every shred of memory. Its leaves shook in the breeze, and its trunk bore the scars of many years, as if it were an ancient witness to all the stories that had ever passed by. Maria approached this tree, her steps slowing. The shadows of the sunset lay upon the ground, colouring everything around her in deep shades of ochre and scarlet. Here, at the roots, she stopped. She took the bundle from her shoulder and placed it carefully on the ground, as if she was giving a part of her soul to this place, a strange and yet quiet refuge. She pulled out a small locket from the bundle, an antique, shabby locket with delicate engraving that was barely legible. It was the last shard of her past, something that connected her to her name, to her home, to what she had once been. Now it was just a weight of memories, too heavy for those who chose to move on. Maria carefully placed the medallion on the ground, next to the knot, as if saying goodbye to this fragment of her life, letting it go forever. She knelt down, stroking the ground with her fingers, feeling the wind gently ruffling the leaves, and whispering words that only those who dared to change could understand. The wind blew harder, picking up the thin piece of paper she held in her other hand. The paper soared into the air, twirled and flew over the meadows, far beyond the village, as if it were a symbol of her loss, of pain let go, of lost names and fears. This moment was her beginning, not just an escape from the past, but a recognition that she could become someone new. Freedom, though with an uncertain future, was closer than ever before. Mary rose from her knees. A deep breath filled her lungs, and in that quiet farewell to the past lurked the dawn of a new life. The old tree stood still, watching the scene, as if accepting the new story that only she could write now, without chains, without attachments, with only one desire, to find her place, her name, and finally her home. Night was descending on the town, and long shadows stretched across the empty streets like ghosts of bygone days. The lanterns cast a dim light on the cracked paving stones, making them shimmer like a fragile mirror of a forgotten world. In the depths of this silence, on the corner of the main street, stood Maria, a figure almost dissolved in the darkness. Her silhouette seemed fragile and lonely, but her eyes, turned toward the distant horizon, burned with living fire. In their depths flickered not just fatigue or fear, but a spark of something new, a hope and determination that was hard to extinguish. The wind played softly with her hair, and the slight movement made it seem as if the night itself were listening intently to her thoughts, to her inner voice, which at last began to whisper not of the past, but of the future. The street in front of her was empty and silent, but this darkness wasn't frightening. It seemed like a space of possibility where you could start anew. Every shadow, every crack in the stones reminded her that the road would be hard, but her heart was ready to fight. The music at that moment slowly changed from a calm, melancholy motif to a more tense and deep sound, foreshadowing the trials to come. The sounds of strings and brass penetrated the silence as if calling for action, for the changes that would inevitably come. Maria took a step forward, never taking her eyes off the distant horizon line. This moment was like the pause before the storm, before the story that was about to begin, the story of a woman with no name, no past, no home, but a rebellious spirit and an unyielding will to live. And so, in the shadows of the night, she stood, ready to defy fate, ready to become someone new, ready to finally find her name and her place in this harsh world of the Wild West. The silence of the small town was deep and almost palpable. Only the occasional rustle of leaves and birdsong in the distance broke the peace. But suddenly that peace was shattered by the clatter of hoofs, sharp and sure, like the blow of a hammer. A tall man on horseback rode slowly out from around the bend. His figure was stern and slight, as if the wind itself were bending to his will. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled down so low that the shadows hid his eyes, but even in the darkness it was clear. A cold fire burned in them, attentive and evaluating. He rode slowly down the main street, scrutinizing every window, every door, as if looking for something long familiar, but carefully hidden. His saddle creaked, and the horse seemed to understand that his master was not accustomed to idle rides. The people of the houses peered out cautiously, whispering, watching the mysterious stranger who seemed to loom over the town, ready to disrupt the usual order. There was tension in the air. There was more to his silence than just a visit. He took his time, moving with the strength and confidence of a man long accustomed to taking what he needed without unnecessary words or explanations. And it was at that moment, in the shadow of the evening light, that a shadow of the past flashed across his face for the first time, something that had drawn him to one place and one woman. Maria. Maria stood at the edge of the street, clutching her small bundle in her hands. Her figure seemed tired, but there was a quiet fire in her eyes, as if she knew something would change. The wind ruffled a strand of her hair, and she stared off into the distance, not noticing the silhouette approaching. Dan appeared almost silently, his steps heavy but precise. He approached her without a word, and there was more in that silence than any speech. The man's hand gripped her shoulder firmly, but without violence, as if to say that now she was not alone. Now he was leading her. His gaze was harsh, as if the very ground beneath his feet might crack from the tension in his soul. Behind that hard shell was a deep pain and an old wound he didn't want to show anyone. But now, in this moment, determination took over. He had not come for war, but to protect. Maria did not pull away, did not resist. Perhaps it was the hope that had long been dormant in her, the hope that even in this world of cruelty there was someone who would take her under his wing. The bundle was quietly passed into Dan's hands as a symbol of concession and the beginning of a new life that was just beginning. The streets of the town stood in anxious silence. Wary eyes appeared from corners and doorways, watching the strange couple. Whispers and conjectures mingled in the air like dark clouds before a storm. No one dared to come closer, and no one knew what to think of the man with the stern face who had suddenly taken the girl without a word. Maria felt this tense atmosphere, as if she herself had become the center of a violent storm. She was torn inside by contradictory feelings, surprise that someone had appeared in her life, fear of the unknown and a new path, and a vague but strong attraction to this man who seemed to decide her fate without the right to ask. Her gaze slid over the faces of the passers-by, their suspicion and judgment burning her from the inside out, but strongest of all was the chill of incomprehension she felt toward Dan. Who was he? What made him come after her specifically? Why didn't he explain, didn't ask, just take her away? A question flashed through her soul that had no answer yet. Despite her fear, Maria's heart beat with renewed vigor, as if in that mysterious shadow of a formidable man lurked the hope of salvation. Though the path was shrouded in darkness, she had already taken a step toward the unknown that promised to change everything. Without a word, Dan put his foot in the stirrup and sat down to ride the horse, as if he had long known this moment would come. He turned his head in her direction, an invitation to follow him, decisive and unmistakable. Maria froze, as if frozen on the edge between the past and an unknown future. A storm played in her eyes, unanswered questions, doubt, fear, and a faint spark of hope. But there was no room for protest, no power to argue. She rose slowly and carefully took the bundle in her hand, her only baggage, which now symbolized both her past and the beginning of a new life. Quietly, almost silently, they moved away from the town. Dust kicked up behind the horses' hooves, and the sun was setting, coloring the sky a blood-orange hue. Behind them was their former life, nameless, forgotten, lost. Ahead lay a road full of uncertainty and new possibilities. In the silence of waddling hooves and the rustle of the wind, thoughts flashed through her mind, a mixture of fear and timid hope, as if a new life was stirring inside her, ready to break through the darkness of the past. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether it would be salvation or a new prison, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back. The past had cooled far behind her, dissolved into dust and sunset. An inner voice whispered that sometimes losing everything was a chance to find yourself anew. And in this silent journey between what was and what will be, a silent determination to not just survive, but to truly live was born. Let this wanderer with cold eyes and heavy silence be the beginning of her new story, where there is no place for fear, but only struggle and hope. The dust beneath her hooves flew in clouds, dissolving into the hot air like invisible ghosts of the passing day. The prairie was a vast expanse of dry grass and sparse thorny bushes under a blazing sun that burned mercilessly and stung in the eyes. The wind, barely perceptible, brought the smell of burning grass and thirsty earth. Dan and Maria rode in silence, each immersed in his own thoughts, as if the walls between them were gradually becoming thinner and the tension was slowly dissolving into the vast expanse. Maria cautiously watched the man next to her, trying to find some sign of trust, while he seemed preoccupied with wrestling with his own past, hidden behind a harsh mask. Silence hung between them, not just the absence of words, but the space where a new understanding was born and the beginning of a journey that didn't promise easy answers. The desert air was suddenly filled with a deafening roar as a sandstorm rose from the horizon. The wind carried with it hot grains of dust that beat against her skin and made her cover her eyes, as if nature itself were trying to erase the traces of their journey. Maria clung tightly to the saddle, feeling the sand penetrate every fold of her clothing, scratching her face and arms. Her thirst grew more and more acute as the water in her hiking flask dwindled at an alarming rate, and only lifeless space stretched around her. The crossing of the swift and cold river was a real ordeal. The rocks slid underfoot, and the current threatened to drag them down into the depths. Every step was a struggle against the merciless elements, every breath a lesson in survival in this new and hostile world. Maria gradually learned to listen to the ground, feel the wind, and read the signs of nature. It was the only way to stay alive when there was no other defense but her own determination. Maria and Dan entered small settlements, humble houses on the edge of the prairie where time seemed to stand still. But the eyes of the locals were sharp and distrustful, as if each passerby carried his own judgment inside. Whispers behind their backs turned into barbed words, and gossip quickly grew about the fugitive and her mysterious companion. No one wanted to accept strangers, especially those who didn't ask questions or explain their motives. On the farms and in the saloons, the atmosphere heated up as wariness turned to open hostility. Words turned into threats, and dangerous glances promised an imminent confrontation. Maria could feel the tension growing around her, as if she herself had become a source of anxiety and fear. Dan remained calm, but his eyes burned with a readiness to defend himself. Behind every movement was a power she didn't want to experience. Conflict was brewing, and their path grew more dangerous, as if the land itself was unwilling to accept the fugitive and the one who came after her. A storm was brewing inside Maria, fear and doubt clashing with quiet gratitude and incomprehensible affection. Every new day with Dan was a test for her soul. Part of her wanted to run away, to hide from the weight of the journey and the impenetrable unknown, from the man who had taken her fate into his own hands without a word. But another part, weak and barely perceptible, began to cling to this new life, to that fragile light of hope that shone through the darkness of the past. In the silence of the nights, when the flames of the fire cast dancing shadows on the faces of the travelers, Maria pondered the meaning of her journey. What lay ahead? Salvation or a new trap? What is worth leaving behind, and what is worth taking with her? In her heart, an inner struggle was born, between the past, which would not let go, and the future, which frightened her with its uncertainty. And yet, despite her fear, she felt that this journey was her chance to find herself anew, to realize who she could become. A special, almost silent dialogue began to form between Maria and Dan. Words were few, but every gesture, every glance became more important than any conversation. He helped her to cope with the difficulties of the journey. He lent a hand in moments of weakness, shared water, protected her from danger. These actions revealed his essence, a strong, stern at first glance man, hiding deep pain and fatigue. In his silence was a story that he was not ready to tell, but that could be felt. The hidden gentleness was evident in the smallest things, in his concern for her, in the rare but sincere glances that spoke more than words. A bond was gradually forming between them, based on trust and mutual support, which was becoming the only anchor in this ruthless world. In the distance, on the horizon, like shadows from the past, the first signs of danger began to appear. The tracks left by their pursuers threatened their fragile tranquility. Unclear silhouettes flickered between the trees, and the sounds of distant footsteps and horses' hooves made their hearts beat faster. These people enemies with a dark past, connected to Maria's or Dan's lives, were unwilling to let them go so easily. Tension rose with every passing moment, like an impending storm, foreshadowing trials that would break or harden them. Invisible threats hung in the air, making the heroes wary and feeling that their journey was just beginning and the real tests were yet to come. The storm broke suddenly. The sky turned black and the wind howled, kicking up dust and debris. Maria barely had time to grab the bundle before the rain came down, heavy and fierce, washing away the road and the tracks. Dan struggled with the reins, his horse frightened by the thunder, but he didn't back down. Somewhere behind, shouts and gunshots could be heard, as if the pursuers were close behind. A torrent of water swept away the flimsy bridge over which they were to cross. The way back was cut off. The way forward was only a shaky bank and knee-deep mud. They had not lost each other in the chaos. He gave her his hand without saying a word, and she took it without hesitation. Fatigue was in their bodies, fear in their eyes, but determination had already settled in their hearts. They took shelter under the rubble of a fallen tree, sharing the last of their dry supplies. The night brought cold and anxiety, but there was strength in that silent unity. Everything around them crumbled, but their bond grew stronger. In the morning, when the storm had passed and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the bare, muddy plain, they rose. Exhausted, muddied, but alive. They chose to go on, together. The sun was rising above the horizon again, coloring the sky a dusty gold. A shroud of mist drifted across the plain like a memory of the night storm. Nature lay silent, knowing there was no room for chance on this road. Only two silhouettes moved forward, slowly, persistently, as if they were led not just by purpose, but by the will to live. Maria sat in the saddle, hunched over with fatigue, but her gaze remained fixed on them. A quiet determination burned in it, like a dim but unyielding fire. She did not know where shelter awaited them, whether the journey would have an end. But fear did not rule her now. There was a strength in her now that neither men, nor storm, nor past could take away. Dan rode beside her, still as silent as if carved from stone. But in the way he held the reins, in the way he turned his head occasionally to Mary, it was clear that he was not alone. Nor was she. Ahead, the road stretched into the endless distance. The expanse was as majestic and indifferent as fate itself, but now they were moving not away from something, but toward it, and that changed everything. The road ended at the end of a ravine, where an old hut was hidden among overgrown bushes. The roof was sagging, as if tired with time, one door sash dangling on its hinge and creaking in the breeze. There were no signs, no trails, no signs of recent life, just a void filled with the sounds of nature. The wind walked between the pine trees, echoing with the sound of the leaves, and somewhere up high a crow cawed, like a reminder that even in solitude someone was watching. It was not a place of safety, but there was something pure and unspoiled about it, a land unspoiled by human oppression. When Maria first saw it, her heart sank. After all she had been through, after the crowds, the stares, the whispers, and the sentences without words, this silence was unbearably loud. It was as if it cut her off from the world in which she had to survive, to hide, to run away. Now she stood in the middle of nowhere, where no one else's eyes could see her, and for the first time she didn't know what to be afraid of. She'd expected it to be easier. That salvation would feel at least a little like calm. But the quieter it got, the clearer her inner voice sounded. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves seemed like a threat. The city was dangerous, but understandable. Here, no rules, no clues, just her, a strange man, and a house as if plucked from a forgotten time. Something stirred inside her, a simultaneous desire to escape and to stay. This place didn't call or repel it, just was. And so was he. Dan didn't explain why he'd come here. He just took the saddle off his horse, looked around, and started checking the ramshackle walls as if he were returning to a place he'd been once before. There was a confidence in his movements that was neither joy nor relief, only necessity. Maria took her time getting off the saddle. Her gaze slid over the cabin, the rough outline of the trees, the burned grass beneath her hooves. Even the sky seemed to be different, not bright, but dull, as if erased by time. And yet there was something appealing in this desolation. Uninhabited, so she could be nobody here, or someone new. The first steps through the dry grass felt heavy. The dust kicked up with every movement, her shoes sinking into the loose earth. When she finally reached the threshold, a strange feeling flashed through her. Not fear or hope, but a weightless pause, like a jump. She didn't know what she would find in this cabin, but she knew one thing. Her old life was finally behind her. With the first few days in the wilderness came the realization. Survival was not a romance by the fire, but a harsh struggle with each passing hour. The morning began with a cold that penetrated to the bones. The dilapidated floor was blown in from below, gaps in the walls let the wind in, and in the corner, instead of a hearth, there was only a blackening pit from which no smoke had risen for a long time. Maria woke up in a pile of old blankets with the feeling that her body was not hers, but broken, exhausted, and tired. The water was far away. The spring was tiny and stubborn, squeezing a thin, capricious trickle out of the ground. Getting to it meant walking through thorny thickets, stumbling more than once, and possibly spilling everything she'd struggled to collect. Her hands trembled with exertion, the bucket felt as heavy as a weight, and every step was an ordeal. Firewood was another torture. Dry twigs were in short supply, so she had to chop them, and the axe in her hands had a life of its own. It fell out, jingled, bounced. One awkward swing, and the splinters flew anywhere but where they needed to go. Her fingers ached from trying to hold on to the log, her body angry at her weakness. She dropped the log, burned herself on a hot rock, and sprinkled ash on herself, fanning the nearly extinguished fire. The flames faded capriciously, hissing and stubbornly refusing to ignite. All this time he had been there, silent, focused, as if cut out of the air itself. Not interfering, not teaching, not pointing. It was just that when she had struggled to light the pitiful flame for the third time, he came over, silently tossed some twigs, adjusted the stones, and let her know. This is the right way. His movements were confident, precise, like a man who had long ago learned to live in conditions where a mistake could cost a life. He did not reproach or condescend. He just showed her, and that was enough. But Maria could feel her irritation growing with each minor setback. Everything was a struggle. It seemed that she was only in the way, only dragging her down. Her pride was hurt. Her desire to prove something was unbearable. She wasn't used to being helpless, even if she didn't know how to defend herself before. And now she was in a world where every day required skills she didn't have, where every move she made screamed, "You're superfluous." Nights she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the logs crackling in the stove he stoked before bed. His shadow moved along the walls, calm, collected, and there was something strangely reliable about that silent presence. She wanted to ask why he tolerated her, but her voice was stuck inside. Instead, she rose again and again in the morning to fetch water, to try to split another log, to light a fire. Not out of stubbornness, but out of some deep-seated need to belong here. With each new dawn, the burden of survival pressed harder on Maria. Every little thing, a bucket that broke on the cold surface of the water, a fire that barely ignited, an axe that slipped from her hands, seemed like a grain of sand falling on her shoulders. And then one day, when the sparks from the stone flared up and nearly burned her palms, the nervous limit was reached. She swung open the door of the hut and stepped out into the blazing sun without looking back. Abrupt movements, trembling hands, intermittent breathing. The path to the source stretched like a thread she held onto, while her thoughts tore like birds from a cage. Why was everything so hard? Why did Dan's silence press harder on her soul than any scream? Why was she still here? Walking back to the cabin, she saw the empty saddle. He was gone, without a word, without a look, just gone. And there was something frightening in that disappearance, not a threat, but indifference. She was alone, truly alone, and the first thing she wanted to do was run. To leave this strange rescue, to go into the void where no one waited for anything. But the night brought cold and silence in which she began to hear herself. She tried to rekindle the fire, but the flames flickered and then went out as if reflecting her inner state. Then she picked up the fallen axe, not as a weapon, but as a challenge to herself. If not her, then no one. With the first rays of the sun, she was already carrying water, going for firewood, pulling up the blanket, unskillfully, uncertainly, but determinedly. In the evening, Dan reappeared a step away from the doorstep. His silhouette was stubbornly calm. In his hands was a game, still warm, with blood on its skin. He laid it on the threshold and turned without looking, as if he wanted to leave again. But she took a step, hesitantly, tentatively, and just stood there. The silence between them was different. Not aloof, not deaf. It was a silence that pulsed with the beginning of something new, slow, difficult, but shared. The days began to flow differently, quieter, denser, filled with business. There were no words, no explanations, but every day Maria felt more and more that she was no longer just a shadow clinging to someone else's path. Now she was part of something, even if not fully understood, but real. Together they repaired the roof. The dry boards creaked beneath their feet, the wind ruffling their hair and ripping nails from their fingers. Dan didn't give instructions, but his movements spoke more clearly than words. Where to stand, what to apply, how to hold the board so it wouldn't move. Maria repeated, watched, tried. Her hands were covered with splinters, but for the first time she was not angry at the pain. On the contrary, there was something alive in it, something necessary. Then they built a fence, a long, crooked line of uneven stakes driven into the hard earth. He dug, she held the stakes. He would hit with a hammer, she would bring up the wire. The earth crunched under their feet, the sun baked their shoulders, and there was a strange feeling in the air, as if not only the wire was stretched between them, but also something thin, invisible, but already strong. Once, when Maria clumsily dropped the bucket of water and it splashed right onto Dan's shoes, she laughed involuntarily. Quietly at first, as if apologizing to the world, then a little louder, allowing herself to be unafraid of this awkwardness. For the first time since the day he'd taken her, the laughter burst out, and though Dan's face remained as stern as ever, something trembled in his gaze. Not an answer, not a smile, but a slight, almost imperceptible softening. After that, the evening was different. She was cooking, and he was silently fiddling with his tools. Yet the air was warmer, the silence less heavy. The night descended gently, without the previous anxiety. In time, her body began to obey. Her hands no longer trembled when chopping wood, her legs no longer shook from the weight of the buckets. She learned to navigate by the sun, to recognize animal tracks by the river, to sew something like curtains from scraps of cloth. Small victories were adding up to something bigger, the feeling that she could, that she was alive. Every morning began with labor, at first grueling, then habitual. She didn't expect help, but she no longer felt alone, and though words were still not born between them, the silence was no longer a wall. It had become a bridge, restrained, strong, going somewhere forward. Some nights were especially quiet, and in that silence Maria caught something new, not outward, but inward. Dan, always silent, didn't grow closer with words, but there were nuances in his silence. It was as if he too heard this silence, felt it, and tried to deal with it in his own way. One day she entered the house a little earlier than he expected. He was sitting by the window, holding an old, almost faded photograph. When he saw her, he slowly hid the picture without saying a word. But there was no irritation in that gesture, rather pain, exposed so sharply that he himself didn't know how to cover it. Since that evening, Maria had begun to notice traces of the past in his things. A metal token with a wiped inscription, a scrap of paper where you could still make out the half word. Then you didn't. In one of the shelves under the boards, she found a folded medal, heavy, with an old symbol, worn away by time. He didn't explain, didn't tell her, didn't try to justify himself. But every day she felt more and more how tightly the past wrapped around his shoulders. It was with him in every gesture, in every glance at the horizon, where he seemed to be searching for something. There was no arrogance in his loneliness, only habit. The habit of being alone, of surviving alone, of not relying on anyone. When she asked him something, even if it was just about the path to the river or the weather, he answered briefly. But sometimes, in the midst of those meager answers, something more would slip through, a memory that had unconsciously burst forth. Once he dropped, "This place was quieter then," and then hesitated. Or another time, glancing at the empty walls, he said, "Someone used to sing here in the morning." These scraps meant nothing to an outsider's ear, but to Maria they became the threads from which understanding was formed. He wasn't just a savior or a random wanderer. Something in her responded to his pain. She didn't know who he had lost, a wife, a daughter, a brother, a friend, but she did know that the emptiness inside him was not cold, but an old wound frozen by time. Maybe it was that wound that made him take her away without asking, without explaining. Maybe in her loneliness he saw a reflection of his own. Watching him every day, Maria felt more and more strongly. He wasn't just a man with a past. He was a man who had been burned by that past, but not broken by it. He walked through life as if he were carrying someone else's debt, someone else's pain, and perhaps in saving her, he was trying to save a part of himself. And though he remained silent, the silence no longer seemed alien. It had become part of the silence they shared, the silence that held both pain and hope. Night had fallen with a heavy blanket, covering the forest and the old cabin in darkness. The wind whispered through the sparse trees, but seemed strangely tense, as if the air itself held its breath. Mary lay on the rough straw mattress, trying to drown out the pounding of her heart, which was beginning to sound louder than usual. Suddenly, the horse in the yard shuddered and spurred, its hooves thudding against the wooden canopy. A dog howled nearby, a lonely guardian who had never shown such alarm before. Dan jumped up from the bed, slipped his cloak over his shoulders, and grabbed the rifle that stood by the door. His eyes, cold and focused, glittered in the dim candlelight. Without a word, he walked out into the darkness, disappearing into the night, leaving Mary alone with the muffled sounds of the forest and a growing sense of unease. Her heart beat harder, but her fear was no longer paralyzing. She could feel something new awakening inside, a responsibility that overwhelmed and empowered her. Here, on the edge of the wilderness, one could not afford weakness. Every movement was worth its weight in gold, every moment an opportunity to survive. Maria got out of bed and walked quietly to the window. The moon was shining through the branches, illuminating the footprints on the ground. Someone had been here recently. The patches of scattered dust, the fresh footprints and hoofprints were no accident. Alien eyes were watching their dwelling. She sensed that this world was not going to let her go easily. The threat was real, and it loomed like a dark cloud over their little haven. But along with the anxiety came a realization. Now she was not just a companion, not just a refugee. She had become a protector, part of this place, part of the story the two of them were writing. The minutes stretched on endlessly. The wind had stopped whispering, but a flame burned in Maria's chest, a flame of readiness to face danger. She had taken the first step toward becoming stronger, not only for herself, but for the one who now stepped out into the darkness with the gun. This night was a new milestone, not only in their journey, but also in her soul. The days seemed longer than usual when Dan returned, barely on his feet. His steps were heavier and his face paler, as if the shadow of illness was gradually consuming his sturdy body. The silence that had previously reigned between them was now filled with a new tension, an anxiety that Mary had never felt before. For the first time, she felt herself not merely a companion on the journey, but a protector, one who must keep this silent and strong man safe. Her hands, previously unsure and timid, were now gently rubbing Dan's cold shoulders, trying to restore his warmth and strength. Mary studied old herbalists and records, gathering wild herbs from the surrounding countryside, brewing concoctions that she hoped would ease the pain and stop the sickness. Each morning began with her fetching water and sitting beside her, watching Dan struggle with his own weakness. In moments when the pain became unbearable, he didn't push her away. His acquiescence to her care was the strongest acknowledgement of trust Mary could receive. His stern face softened as she held his hand, and there was a flicker of gratitude in his eyes that he could not put into words. It was a new form of their relationship, without words, but with a deep bond that could not be broken. Nights were spent in silence, with only the sound of the wind and her soft footsteps around the hut to disturb the peace. She was learning to be present despite the fear and uncertainty. In this silent exchange of care, they both found support, Mary accepting responsibility, and Dan allowing to be weak and needy. A feeling grew inside her that their fates were now inextricably linked. The one who had once seemed impregnable and closed off was now vulnerable, and she was his keeper. And in this new balance, between strength and weakness, there was hope that together they could overcome whatever this harsh world had in store for them. The sky darkened suddenly, as if nature itself had decided to test their strength. The wind picked up with such force that the ground seemed to shake beneath their feet, and dust and dry grass flew up in a whirlwind like beasts of prey, ready to gnaw everything in their path. Maria felt the tension clenching her heart, and Dan, as if he had become a linchpin in the chaos, silently gathered what was needed: barrels of water, sandbags, skins to shade the windows. They acted without words, as one, each understanding the task and the moment. Dan aptly tossed a bucket of water onto the already smouldering embers, and Mary quickly hauled heavy logs to block the fire's path. The wind grew fiercer, and now sparks were shooting from the house like little flaming dragonflies. Time slowed, but did not stop. Every second was a fight for their lives and their shelter. Maria felt her muscles burning with tension and her breathing becoming ragged. This was not romance, but a primal, hard fight with the elements, where there was no room for weakness or fear. The fire was greedily devouring everything around them, but they managed to delay its escape. The hut was battered, the walls charred, the roof barely holding, but most importantly, they stayed together, breathing, tired, but alive. There was more than relief in their gazes, but recognition that the bond that had been formed between them was stronger than any fire. The air was cleaner after the storm, and in that cleansing, something new sounded in their silence, a silent promise to fight and survive no matter what. The cabin may have been destroyed, but their union was stronger than ever before. The morning came calmly, as if nature itself was tired after the night's ordeal. The sky was cloudless, clear and bright, and the sun barely touched the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the landscape. There was an unusual silence, as if the world had stood still after the storm, as if the air itself had held its breath. Smoke rose lazily over the roof of the hut, reminding me of yesterday's battle, leaving in the air the faint odor of burning wood and the freshness of rain. The charred trees standing nearby seemed like fragile statues, capturing a moment of struggle and survival. Maria walked across the soft grass to the well with a bucket in her hands. Her movements were clumsy, The traces of yesterday's battles with nature could still be felt in every gesture, but a new confidence was already evident in her gait. Every movement was evidence of a small victory over herself, over fear and helplessness. Dan stood at the entrance, watching her. His gaze was intense, but without the usual sternness. There was respect in it, a quiet, deep respect, as if he finally saw not just a companion, but an equal. There was something else in his eyes, too. Something complex, almost tender, that he rarely allowed himself to show. Maria turned suddenly, meeting his gaze. A smile flashed across her face, short, dim, but genuine, warming them both more than any word could. It was as if they realized in that moment that their journey had only just begun, and together they could endure whatever this merciless land had in store for them. The thin light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Maria noticed the first signs of disturbance around their cabin. Broken branches were scattered about, as if someone had hurried across this stretch of land without caring what they left behind. Hoofprints in the soft earth indicated the recent presence of horses, strange horses that carried strange men. A gusty wind rustled in the tree crowns, and it seemed as if nature itself was warning, but the words of that silence were too subtle for Mary to understand at once. The day was fading away, and as night fell, the uneasiness grew. Muffled voices were heard in the distance, now and then broken by a sharp laughter or a metallic clang. Sounds alien and dangerous. An inner voice whispered that these were not just passing travelers, but those who pursued a purpose that could not be called good. The dog that had been guarding their camp all night raised its head nervously, making low growls, and listened more and more to the rustles around it. Her gaze was wary and urgent. Dan stood motionless in the shade of the tree, his eyes gazing sharply into the darkness. His body tensed like a bow drawn for a shot, but his lips remained tight and his silence impenetrable. Not a single word was spoken, but in that silence resounded all the gravity of expectation and hidden readiness for the inevitable. Maria felt that behind that silent wall lay a whole world, a world in which they now had to fight not only for survival, but for their own destiny. Through the thick fog of the early morning mist that hung over the hills and sparse shrubs, silhouettes appeared on the horizon, several people moving cautiously and silently. Their figures blended in with the surrounding nature, like ghosts stealthily studying every inch of ground around the hut. They were scouts sent ahead, the eyes and ears of those who were not about to let the uninvited guests just walk away. Their faces remained hidden beneath the brims of wide-brimmed hats and thick scars from the wind and sun. Maria felt the tension in the air thicken like a cloud before a storm. Dan froze beside her, his gaze sharp and focused like a drawn bow. He was acting differently. For the first time in a long time, there was a shadow of fear in his eyes, barely perceptible but deeply piercing. It wasn't just a warning, it was an awareness of impending danger that could not be ignored. The silence between them grew louder than any shout. They both knew that now was not the time for words, not the time for mistakes. Every breath and every step could be fatal. For the first time, Maria saw vulnerability behind the mask of cold determination, that rare human side that Dan tried to hide from the world. In that moment, their silent tension was a real conversation. A conversation about fear, survival, and the inevitable struggle that was coming at them by the minute. The wind carried stranger words through the branches of the trees, scraps of conversations and rumors that reached the hut through the rare travelers and traders. With each passing day, the shadows drew closer, and behind them loomed a threat that could not be ignored. The raiders, whose names were whispered cautiously, or the sheriff, whose resolve seemed unyielding, carried with them a storm that could turn everything upside down. In a nearby village, Maria and Dan tried to find support, at least a little respite or information, but they met only suspicion, cold stares, and a reluctance to help outsiders. The faces of the locals were closed, and their words were barbed and harsh. The shadows in their eyes promised not help, but new trials. Maria felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her from all sides, covering her with a wave of hopelessness. But deep down, amidst the gloom, there was a quiet, persistent spark, a determination not to give up, to fight to the end. Her gaze grew firmer, her breathing more even. They were on the cusp of change, and Maria knew there would be a battle ahead, not only for survival, but for their freedom. The air grew heavy with tension as those who had not come in peace stepped forward. The faces of the strangers were hard and uncompromising, eyes cold and hands barely touching the handles of their weapons. The words spoken in the shadows of the dusty road sounded like a challenge, filled with threat and demanding obedience. Their intentions were clear. They had come to take what they thought was theirs, without regard for the fate of those who stood in their way. Dan stood as still as a rock, firm and unwavering. His gaze, cold and silent, told that he knew the price of this fight, but would not be the first to fire unnecessarily. Every movement, every moment, reflected his inner determination to defend and endure, not to give himself over to chance or recklessness. Maria could feel the fear coursing through every cell in her body. For the first time, she realized clearly how cruel and merciless this world was, and how high the stakes were in this game. But along with that fear came the realization that this was not just a clash with the enemy, but a fight for a new life, for the right to be free and protected. And though her heart pounded with fear, a spark ignited deep inside her, a spark of willingness to fight, no matter what. The sky darkened under the weight of the coming storm, as if sensing impending danger. The footsteps of the pursuers grew closer, and every rustle and crunch of twigs made Dan and Mary's hearts beat faster. They hid behind thick bushes and boulders, carefully navigating a wilderness where every move could be fatal. The raiders and sheriffs left no attempt to catch up with them. Gunshots, muffled hoofbeats, and scraping metal clinked tightly with the shadow of the chase. The shadows of the pursuers flickered among the trees, trying to find traces of the fugitives. But Dan, like a ghost, was evading the traps and hiding Maria in the most inaccessible hiding places. Every moment required an instant decision: when to fight, when to hide, when to sacrifice time for safety. Maria, exhausted and frightened, felt for the first time the weight of the fight for life, not only for herself, but for the one who had become more than a protector to her. Their path was strewn with risks and cruel trials, but in this chaos an unshakable bond was born, a bond that was strengthened not by words, but by fighting together, by surviving in the same world where death could come at any moment. As the shadows of the pursuers thickened around them, Mary and Dan learned to hear each other without words. In every look, every gesture, a silent agreement was born about who must act and how they must act to stay alive. In these moments of silent support, they found the strength that gave them hope for survival. Danger became part of their everyday life, making their hearts beat in unison with the rhythm of the wilderness. Fear and anxiety gradually gave way to a calm determination, where every step meant not just fighting an external enemy, but an inner rebuilding, accepting each other despite the past and misunderstandings. Maria, increasingly aware of the support of the silent and stern Dan, was no longer afraid of her own vulnerability. There was a new spark in her eyes, not just hope, but recognition that there was someone who not only protected her, but accepted her for who she was. The change was quiet, but profound, like a slowly growing root that could not be pulled out. Dan, for his part, didn't express his feelings in words, but his actions spoke the loudest. He stood guard, protected, shared the last of his supplies, and cared for Mary as if she were his most precious possession. A new form of trust was born in this silent union that became their anchor in a raging world. After the tumultuous events, there was a brief lull. The weight of tension still lingered around them, but the setting allowed them to put down their weapons for a while and get on with what seemed long forgotten, repairing the hut, reinforcing the fence, finding fresh water and foraging for food. Every gesture was filled with quiet determination to keep what they had managed to hold on to and prepare for the inevitable. Maria was learning in this pause to appreciate not only the silence, but also the opportunity to gather her thoughts. Her fatigue was evident in every movement, but in her gaze there was a flame of inner strength, a mixture of anxiety and hope, fear of the coming ordeal and the will to endure for the sake of a new life. She realized that this respite was only a temporary moment before the storm. Dan watched her with quiet respect. His stern face reflected not only fatigue, but something more, a willingness to face danger for the sake of the one he had taken under his protection. There was an unwavering determination in his gaze, like a promise not to give up, no matter how hard the struggle ahead. The road they had chosen remained full of unknowns and threats, but now they had a strong bond, and that strength gave them the courage to go on. A moment of peace enveloped them, but the shadow of impending war kept them from forgetting. The real fight was just beginning. Maria sat by the weak fire, looking into the embers where her inner storm blazed. In this stillness of night, old fears awoke like ghosts. The loneliness that always stood behind her like a cold wind, the ruthless defenselessness in the face of a world in which she was not master. Those feelings clutched her chest tightly, poisoning every breath, urging her to run back to the past, where everything seemed familiar, though broken. An inner voice, barely audible and insidious, began to whisper. She was a victim of circumstance, a prisoner of someone else's will, whose path was predetermined. It clung to her thoughts, making her doubt that she had any right to freedom or happiness at all. But somewhere deep, beneath the layer of fear, lived another longing, to reclaim her name, to find her true self, not who Dan saw and held her to be. A desire to break out of the shadows, to stop being just a companion, to become the master of her own destiny. Every thought was a struggle between the fear of giving in and the power to rise up, between running backward and going forward. And in this silence, among the rustles of the night wind, Maria felt for the first time that this struggle was her own, and only she would decide who she really was. In the silence of the long evenings, Maria often sank into reflection, trying to figure out what this new life meant to her. The freedom she longed for was intertwined with a sense of dependence on Dan, on circumstances, on the vast expanse of land that both beckoned and frightened her. Where was the fine line between protection and confinement? When does care become a chain and support become shackles? These questions remained unspoken, like shadows creeping into the corners of her mind. The fear of losing herself in someone else's fate gripped her heart tightly. Maria was afraid of dissolving into this cruel reality, of not being who she used to be, or maybe who she wanted to be. But along with that, small victories slowly dawned. Each new skill learned on burning coals and in the harsh wind, each independent step, like a tiny light in the night, ignited confidence in her. She was learning to hold her body and her thoughts, learning to be herself in this world where every day was a test. In those efforts, a quiet affirmation that she wasn't lost yet, and that her journey was just beginning. Deep within Dan's soul smoldered shadows of the past that he hid from the world behind an impenetrable mask of silence and restraint. Loss of loved ones, betrayal, guilt, all of it left an indelible mark on him. Every day he carried with him the weight of those events that had broken his soul and taught him not to trust. That fear of opening himself up, of letting someone too close, was his protection, like armor hiding his wounds from the gaze of others. His coldness and latent cruelty were not an expression of indifference, but rather a desperate attempt to keep himself from repeating the pain. He was afraid of repeating the mistakes of the past, afraid that he would once again lose those who had become dear to him. That was why his world was built on distance, where there was no room for weakness or vulnerability. Beneath that layer of harshness lurked a wound he didn't know how to heal, and Maria, slowly creeping into his life, was the first light that could begin to dispel the darkness. Maria and Dan, two people, each with their own fears and wounds, were caught in a quiet but intense struggle. Maria resisted what seemed to be an assault on her freedom and her past, trying to hold on to the remnants of the life that gave her some footing. Her inner voice clung to her memories, and her desire to reclaim her name and control over her destiny resisted Dan's silent pressure. his quiet authority, built not by words but by actions and looks. But in these contradictions there were also moments of rare mutual understanding. Without words, without loud confessions, only through looks, gestures, and shared efforts at survival, sparks of trust passed between them. They began to feel that their fears and needs were inextricably linked. This was not just a struggle for power or freedom, but an attempt to find common ground with themselves and each other. It was through these moments, through the subtle pause in tension, that healing was born. Trust, though fragile and unstable, was becoming the bridge that connected their broken souls. Slowly, step by step, they learned to lean on each other, opening the door to a new world where the fears still lived, but did not entirely possess them. There came a moment when the past of each of them burst into the present with full force, inexorable, heavy, and demanding. An inner crisis was tearing them apart from within, exposing old wounds and fears that seemed forgotten. Maria came face to face with the shadows of her former life, the loss, the pain, and the desire to run back to the familiar shackles. But now it was no longer an escape, but a challenge to herself. She'd made a decision to fight for the right to be herself, not just Dan's shadow, but a separate person with her own rights and voice. It was not a loud protest, but a quiet but firm choice. The first conscious step toward freedom and trust that could be seen in her actions, whether it was a determined look, a word she finally spoke, or an action that symbolized her inner transition. This step was not only a turning point in her life, but also the key that opened the door to a true understanding with Dan. He saw not just a companion, but an equal, willing to move forward together despite the fears and shadows of the past. In this silent agreement, a new hope was born for a future where everyone could be themselves and together face any storm. In the distance, along the winding sandy path, a quiet rumble began, the muffled stomping of many horses and the heavy creaking of wheels. Mary and Dan stood at their humble shelter, an old hut surrounded by the shade of sparse trees and reeds that grew along the creek. The first rays of the sun had barely touched the horizon, but the air was already tense, as if nature itself were holding its breath. The shadows of enemies approached quickly, the sheriff and his posse, or the pursuers from Dan's dark past, wearing cold determination on their faces. Their silhouettes blended into the horizon, but Dan's eyes picked out every tiny sign of movement, every sound. He knew this fight wasn't just for shelter, a tiny piece of land in the middle of the desert, but for what they'd begun to build here together. For life, for a name, for the right to be themselves. Dan silently took command. His movements were restrained, precise, like a man who had been through many such trials. Together with Maria, they began to strengthen the defenses around the hut, knocking down boards, laying branches, preparing stones for throwing. Maria, despite the trembling in her hands, picked up every word, every movement. She was learning to fight not only with weapons, but also with fear. Their gazes crossed, but there were no words. Too much silence and too much anxiety. Each realized that behind that calmness was a storm of inner fear mixed with a determination not to back down. They knew the cost of this battle and the cost of a life that hung in the balance. The night had almost receded when Maria grabbed the gun, feeling its weight in her hands. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of their struggle, their resistance. Dan walked over and, without saying a word, put his hand on her shoulder, a gesture full of support and faith that could not yet be put into words. And so they stood, preparing for the inevitable, two against a formidable army, united by one goal, to preserve what had become their home and their lives. The wind ruffled the dry grasses, reminding them that the time had been chosen, and the outcome of the battle was only half decided. The air clenched with tension as the first figures in the distance began to blur into the morning mist, slowly approaching the hut. The enemies closed the ring like predators surrounding their hiding place. The silence before the storm was piercing. Every step, every rustle sounded too loud, like a harbinger of the coming storm. The first shot rang out with a sharp crack, shattering the morning silence, and a gunfight broke out. Stones tumbled from the ground, boards rattled with the impact of bullets. Maria felt adrenaline boiling in her veins, fear mixed with surprising determination. This was her first real fight, and she couldn't afford to waver. Her fingers, accustomed to light work on the farm and in the house, now gripped the gun tightly. Maria moved quickly and accurately, as if she were learning to master her body anew. She was able to aim with confidence, fending off enemy attacks, and for the first time she realized that something new was awakening in her, a courage that could not be hidden behind fear. Dan, standing a little to the side, watched and controlled the battle like an experienced captain. His eyes, cold and focused, calculated the enemy's every move. He did not rush into the attack blindly. His actions were calculated and precise. Every shot had a purpose. Every step had meaning. He put all his strength to protect not only the hut, but also Maria, who was becoming part of his life. At times, the silent interaction between them seemed more complex than the battle itself. Without words, they communicated impulses of trust and support to each other. There was hope and fear, determination and tenderness in those looks. The whole world narrowed down to this small patch of land, this battle where they would stand or fall. Bullets whistled through the air, and the ground beneath her feet shook with the rumble of battle. But in this chaos, Maria felt that she was more than just a victim of circumstance. She was a fighter who was ready to defend what was dear. This first contact with the enemy was more than just an encounter. It was the birth of a new Maria, strong and determined. The battle gradually subsided, giving way to the deafening ringing of pain and the emptiness that settled among the ashes and ruins. Among those standing beside Maria and Dan, not all remained unharmed. One of their closest allies, sturdy and loyal, collapsed, badly wounded, his eyes glittering with pain and fear, his body shaking as if from the piercing wind of death. It was the first real loss, a blow that not only shook their defenses, but shattered their inner world. Maria couldn't believe how quickly everything around her was changing. Yesterday's struggle for survival had turned into a struggle for life and memory. Her hands shook as she tried to stop the blood, and her heart clenched with bitterness and helplessness. Dan stood beside her, silent, but his face expressed the same pain as Maria's. Their silence was filled with words that could not be spoken, words of loss, fear, and deep resentment toward fate. In that moment, when the wound on the body of one of their defenders became a symbol of fragility and vulnerability, another thing was revealed, Dan's past, which until then had remained hidden behind a heavy veil of silence and mystery. A flash of memories, scraps of conversations and glances, a hard truth he didn't want to admit even to himself. The cause of the conflict became clear. Old scores, betrayals, and debts that he could not forget, and which now threatened again to destroy everything they had built. In these revelations, Maria saw not only the man who had taken her under his wing, but also a man scarred by life, afraid of losing what was now meaningful to him. The losses and wounds became not only a physical challenge, but a catalyst for their inner change. They realized the cost of struggle, not just the blood and pain, but the bonds that are strengthened in the fire of adversity. It was this realization, this deep scar in their souls, that was the first step in becoming not just survivors, but true fighters, for themselves, for each other, and for the new life they were trying to build in the midst of the wilderness. The moment came when the precarious balance between life and death was finally shaken. The enemy, sensing the weakness of the defense, unceremoniously broke through the outer barrier and seized a part of the area around the hut. Their advance was swift and relentless, like a shadow devouring the last pockets of light. For Maria and Dan, it was a challenge that left no choice. The situation seemed almost hopeless. Hope was fading with every step the enemy took. But it was at this very moment, when all seemed lost, that true strength was born. They stood side by side, looking over the ruins and hearing the approaching rumble of the enemy. There was no longer the same uncertainty or fear in Maria's eyes, only determination. She saw that Dan's gaze, too, reflected not fear, but a cold willingness to face death for what they valued. Without further ado, without looking back at the past, they made a bold decision. Not to yield further, but to fight back. Counterattack or withdrawal. It was not an easy choice, but it was the choice that determined their fate. Their alliance, tested by time and pain, became unbreakable. They were not just fighting side by side, they were one. Every gesture, every movement was filled with a silent understanding and trust that didn't come immediately, but became a strong foundation in hours of danger. A crisis that could have torn them apart had, on the contrary, brought them together. The inner fire born of the struggle for life and freedom made their hearts beat in unison. They were ready to go to the end, together, against the whole world. It was at this turning point that their true strength was revealed, not only in their weapons and cunning, but also in their boundless faith in each other. This moment became the starting point for a new chapter of their life together, a chapter where every step was filled with meaning and every breath with hope for the future. It was time for the decisive blow, the final assault that would determine the fate of their shelter and of the heroes themselves. A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by quick, hoarse breathing and uncertain footsteps on rocks and branches. The enemy, like a predator, was preparing for one last rush, desperate to break the resistance while they still had strength. Maria and Dan stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes not just ready to fight, but with the fire of intransigence burning in them. Each knew that this could be their last fight, that the price would be too high. But there was no retreat. Here, in this tiny piece of wild land, they had built something of their own, something worth fighting for to the end. In the swirl of chaos and bullets, in the sound of explosions and screams, everyone made their choice. Someone closest to them, a trusted friend or ally, gave their life, covering the others with their bodies, accomplishing a feat that will forever be remembered by Maria and Dan. That sacrifice was a bitter but necessary price to pay for the chance to stay alive and keep what was dear. The battle was fierce. It seemed that the very earth itself shook under the onslaught of the enemy and the resistance, but at the decisive moment, the strength of the opponents began to run out. The enemy, tired and demoralized, began to retreat, taking the defeat with him, but leaving behind traces of destruction and pain. As the noise of battle died down, and the last shadows of the enemy dissolved into the twilight, Mary and Dan remained on the battlefield, exhausted but undefeated. Their shelter was damaged, but standing. The price of victory was high, but the lessons and wounds would only make them stronger. This moment, drenched in bitterness and hope, was a new frontier, a boundary between a past full of fear and loss and a future they would build together, no matter what. When the last echoes of the battle died down, there was an oppressive silence, as if the earth itself had exhaled, letting go of the tension and pain that had accumulated. There was destruction all around, fallen branches, scattered debris, caterpillar tracks on the damaged planks of the hut, but inside it was the barely visible but unbroken flame of life. Maria and Dan, tired and exhausted, slowly walked around the destroyed dwelling, weighing the loss. The faces of friends and allies who were no longer around seemed like ghosts on the brink of oblivion, but their sacrifice had left a deep mark, a lesson that could not be ignored. The loss was a heavy burden that pulled at the pain and despair, but it also created a determination not to repeat the mistakes of the past. In their gazes was the realization of a new reality, where former goals and dreams had been re-evaluated. Maria realized that it was no longer possible to hide in the shadows of other people's fates, that she must take her life into her own hands to determine her own name and path. Dan, in turn, saw how important the power of trust is, how closely their destinies are intertwined, and how it is impossible to move forward without it. They decided to move forward, to seek a new home, new meaning, new hope. The road may be difficult and unpredictable, but now they are not alone. Together they are stronger, and together they will be able to face all the trials that fate prepares for them. Under that clear, starry sky, in a silence filled with heavy breathing and whispering wind, a new phase of their lives began, unconquered and full of mystery, but no longer frightening. Because now they had the most important thing, each other. Burnt branches and dry grass crunched underfoot, soaking up the smell of smoke and blood. There was a thick silence in the air, a silent exhalation of the earth after the deafening storm of gunfire and screams. The ash fell slowly from the clouds, settling on the charred remains of the hut, the splintered boards and twisted tree roots that stretched up into the sky like bent skeletons. The wounds of the earth were evident. Overturned crates, scattered splinters, footprints and hoofprints soaked with water and blood. Everything seemed motionless, as if time had frozen, and the power that had boiled a moment ago had run out and gone into the void. It seemed as if nature itself had stopped to let go of this horror and take a momentary pause. It was a silence not of peace, but of survival, a breathing before the new battle that could come at any moment. In this silence, one could feel the fragility of life and at the same time an unbroken will. The war had left traces not only on the ground, but also in the hearts of those who remained standing. Maria and Dan slowly walked around the area where the fierce battle had been raging. Each step echoed in their minds. Broken boards, burned spots on the ground, the remnants of arrows and shell casings that reminded them of those who could no longer stand in defense of this place. The bitterness of loss still hung in the air, but alongside it was a quiet pride. They had managed to hold on, to stand firm in the face of cruelty and betrayal. Their gazes crossed with those shadows that seemed almost alive in memory, the friends who were gone, those who had sacrificed themselves to save the others. Without words in their hearts lived gratitude and sorrow, deep and unspoken. In this silence, a new bond was born, strong as steel, between the living and the departed. Maria's fingers slid over the burned sill, a symbol of what had been destroyed but not broken. Inside her, she felt a new strength growing with each crack and scar, ready to lead the way. The silence after the battle opened up a new reality for Maria and Dan One that was forever different from their previous lives. Much had been lost: hopes, peace, carefree. Now every breath, every glance carried with it the echo of a change that could not be ignored. It was as if life had laid itself bare, revealing the essence, what was important and what remained in the past like a forgotten shadow. Priorities were being rearranged, giving way to a new understanding, protecting loved ones, preserving what they had built together, and striving for the freedom that was now of special value. Maria could feel her old fears and doubts dying away, giving way to determination and strength. An inner voice said, "The way back is closed, and there is only struggle and growth ahead, albeit at a cost." Dan, silent and unwavering, reflected the same thoughts. They both knew that nothing would ever be the same again, and it wasn't scary, just a new truth to accept. Maria felt a new strength growing inside her with each battle she fought, not the strength that comes with weapons, but the strength that comes from overcoming fear and doubt. Her steps grew more confident, her gaze firmer, and her heart freer. She was no longer someone who feared the past or hid from the future. She was awakening in her, capable of making decisions and taking responsibility for her own destiny. Dan, usually reserved and closed, began to look at the concept of trust in a new way. The price of this trust became clear to him. It was not a weakness, but a strength that required the courage to open up, to recognize vulnerability, and to allow another person to be there for you. In that recognition lay a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Both realized that change was not just words, but a reality that had become part of their lives. Their inner growth and willingness to walk together, despite their fears and wounds, created an invisible but strong bond between them, the foundation upon which a new chapter of their existence was being built. Under the cover of silence and the fading day, one close ally, whose eyes had long worn the shadow of weariness and pain, made the decision to leave. It was not just a physical parting. It was a choice made in the depths of the soul, where there was no strength left to continue the fight, or where there was hope to find another way, quieter and far from bloodshed. The parting was without words. Gazes met, and parting became a mute agreement. In that silence there was respect for the path they had travelled together, and the understanding that everyone chooses his own destiny. No tears, no vows, just a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. This departure left a slight bitterness in the air, but also space for new beginnings. After all, life went on, and those who remained had even more responsibility to keep the memory alive, to take care of each other, and to go forward no matter what. Mary and Dan, standing amidst the rubble and traces of the battle, felt a deep unity that could not be destroyed by fear or loss. In their eyes burned a fire that had not died out after the storm, a fire of determination and faith that a new life lay ahead despite the trials. They made a quiet but firm decision to stay, not just to survive, but to fight, to build, to find meaning and freedom. It was not a promise without fear or doubt, but a conscious choice to walk together, shoulder to shoulder, supporting each other in the hardships to come. The future remained vague and unpredictable, but in that uncertainty there was strength, a strength born of struggle and trust. They knew that no matter how many roads lay ahead, they could travel them together, and that gave them hope, the kind of hope that follows every storm into the dawn. The fire crackled softly in the evening darkness, casting dancing shadows on Maria and Dan's faces. There was a silence all around, deep and intense, not an emptiness, but a space filled with something that words cannot convey. Their silence was both calm and meaningful, as if every look and breath said that they had been through so much and were not broken. In that simple moment by the fire, amid the rustles of the night and the twinkling stars, a new stage was beginning. Not an easy one, but their own. Tired bodies and souls were undaunted, and hearts were ready to face whatever the dawn would bring. So, under the cover of night, Maria and Dan became not just survivors, but those who chose to go forward, together and with their eyes open. Under the scorching prairie sun, Maria and Dan walked back to their shelter, the very same shelter that had survived the storm and the battle. The cabin, though battered by time and battle, was still strong. They walked carefully around every board, every crack, as if examining an old friend who would live on. Together, in silence, they gathered up the scattered things, reinforced the walls, rebuilt the roof, as if, brick by brick, they were rebuilding not just a house, but a new meaning. Maria's hands, now confident and skillful, were learning anew, tying ropes, fixing the stove, preparing food over an open fire. Dan, used to the harsh conditions, watched with quiet pride as she grew up in this world where every action was a struggle and a victory. They shared the chores equally. Some chopped wood, some stoked the water, some went for herbs. In this joint labor, their new life, their little fortress, was born. In the evenings, when the sky turned scarlet, they sat side by the fire, silently feeling each other's presence. In those quiet moments, the house became more than just shelter. It became a space where two could be themselves, where they could learn to trust and care, not with words, but with deeds. In the silence of the new morning, Maria said her name aloud for the first time, not in a whisper, not in fear, but with a firm confidence, as if she were reclaiming a long-lost part of herself. That name, once taken from her without choice, now sounded like the promise of a new life. She allowed herself to choose not only what to wear, but how to walk the earth, how to look at the world, how to be. Every small gesture, a simple habit, a hand gesture, a choice of dress color, became an act of freedom. Her body and mind were getting used to the fact that she was not someone's shadow, not just an object of care, but an independent person. The past, though still a memory, no longer held her in chains. It became a story she could accept rather than try to hide or forget. Maria was learning to trust herself, to accept her feelings and desires. This internal process was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was what created a solid foundation to step forward without looking back at old fears. Each day brought her closer to the woman who could say, "I do," and be heard. Deep inside Dan, hidden behind the stern gaze and hardened exterior, another side was slowly awakening. No less strong, but much softer and more vulnerable. His former toughness, which had been a shield against pain and loss, was beginning to give way to care, shown in the little things. Cooking, being there quietly, listening without words. He was no longer just a protector, ready to fight every enemy. Dan was now a partner, a friend, a man you could trust. His hands, used to holding the gun, were now gently guiding Maria in her new steps, supporting her when she hesitated. This mutual influence was changing them both. Maria was growing in strength and confidence, and he was learning to open up and accept support. Together they became an unbreakable union. Two sides of the same story that, despite their wounds and fears, were building something new and real. Home was no longer just a shelter from the winds and storms. It was now a space where one could breathe fully, where each morning brought not fear, but hope. The walls that had seemed cold and alien before were filled with the warmth of joint efforts, the sounds of life and quiet conversations without words. For Maria, the new house was more than just a roof over her head. It was a metaphor for her personal awakening, a space where she could be herself without looking back and without fear of the future. Her name, spoken aloud for the first time since it still belonged to her, sounded like a manifesto of freedom and the right to choose. It was the same for Dan. Home became a symbol not only of protection but of trust, of being able to open their hearts and not hide behind the armor of loneliness. Their new life was the beginning of a journey where every step was filled with meaning and the promise of growth, strength, and change. The evening was falling with a soft blanket, and there was silence around their new home, not empty, but filled with promise. The road ahead was not easy or without danger, but now it was theirs, traveled together and by their own rules. Each step was a choice, each decision a manifestation of a power they had never known before. Maria and Dan stood side by side, silently feeling each other's support, realizing that loneliness was behind them. In their unity, a new power was born, not only physical, but also inner, capable of overcoming any storms of fate. Hope warmed their hearts, and despite all that was yet to come, they were ready to move on, to the life they were building for themselves. This was not just a story of salvation. It was a story of two lost people finding home and freedom in each other. The morning slowly awakened, as if in no hurry to lift the weight of the night from their shoulders. The wind that had torn the hair and driven the dust across the prairie for so long had died down, giving way to a soft, almost insensible silence. Instead of the usual noise, there was only the barely audible chirping of birds awakening to life. The sky was getting lighter. The first rays of the sun glided gently across the fields, coloring the earth in delicate shades of pink and gold. Every blade of grass, every tree seemed to breathe this new morning, giving a sense of peace and renewal. There was hope in that calm, quiet, but inevitable, like the promise of a new life that could now be trusted. The silence around them wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a sense of freedom from the constant danger that had hung over their every move for so long. The danger that used to be an integral part of their lives now seemed like a distant echo. The newfound safety was perceived as a rare gift, like a fragile flower to be cherished and nurtured. Every moment without worry seemed priceless, a reminder that it was possible to live without fear, to breathe fully and let oneself dream of the future without clenching one's fists in anticipation of trouble. It was a new reality, unfamiliar, but welcome, like light after a long night. Hope was awakening in their hearts like a quiet stream that gradually turns into a mighty river. Fatigue and fear, long settled in the soul, began to recede, giving way to inner peace and faith in a bright future. For Maria, it was the feeling that for the first time in a long time, she could let herself dream without looking at the past and other people's words. For Dan, it was the realization that not all wounds stay forever, and that strength is not only in the ability to fight, but also in the ability to trust. Their steps became more confident and their gaze more relaxed. The change wasn't always visible outwardly, but inside, a new confidence grew, quiet but unshakable, a hope that became their constant companion on the road ahead. Their newfound home came alive under their hands. Each day was a new step toward creating a life together. Maria and Dan tended the land and animals together, shared the cares and joys of everyday life, and learned to understand each other in small things and big things. Routine activities, fixing the roof, gathering firewood, cooking, became rituals that strengthened their union and symbolized the release from previous anxieties. In every movement, there was a strength born of unity and mutual respect. They gradually wove the new habits into the fabric of their lives, as if weaving a strong cloth where the fears of the past lost power, giving way to hope and freedom. Each day together was like a small victory over pain, loneliness, and the unpredictability of the world, opening the way to a new life. The shadows of the past came sometimes, like quiet rustles in the night, but now Maria and Dan looked at them differently. They were no longer prisoners of memories, but rather bearers of the history that had shaped them, made them stronger and wiser. Pain and loss no longer held them back, but became lessons that helped them understand themselves and each other more deeply. The past was no longer a dark burden, but a bridge to a new life. Their history was no longer a tragedy, but a path together, a road to freedom and mutual acceptance. This realization brought inner relief and calm, like a long-awaited release from a heavy chain. Now they could move on without looking back and live in the present, filled with meaning and hope. There was more than just a partnership in their shared silence and gaze. It was a deep human connection based on mutual recognition and acceptance. They learned to see in each other not only past hurts and fears, but also the inner strength they used to hide under the mask of loneliness. This understanding gave them peace of mind, like a strong bulwark in the storm of life. Together, they became an unbreakable union, ready to face any trials that fate might prepare. Their bond became a source of strength, allowing them to move forward with confidence and hope, without fear of falling and loss. They knew that together they were invincible. Around them, the earth was gradually coming to life. The first tender shoots were sprouting in the garden, like symbols of new life and hope. The house, renovated by their joint efforts, now stood not as a shelter from the storms of the past, but as a fortress of their future, filled with light and warmth. In every detail, from the fresh towels to the neatly folded tools, there was a melody of renewal and forward motion. The horizon was wide open, the sky was clear, and the prairie winds no longer seemed a threat but a reminder of the journey ahead. Their steps, though cautious, led to open vistas where they could choose, dream, and just be themselves. This new path was not just a story of survival, but a story of two lost people finding their home and each other. Thank you for your time and trust. If this story touched you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe. And new stories are ahead of you. Exciting, poignant, full of drama and lively feelings. See you soon.